what to wear. Time was you had a coat, hat, shirt, trousers and boots if you were lucky, and you made them last. Now we change our outfits every day. And we can because they're so cheap. Why? This is how clothes used to be made. By hand, in the home. I've dropped a stitch here, don't tell me Nan. It was time consuming, so you looked after them. But then, in 1598, something revolutionary happened. The Reverend William Lee, in a place called Calverton in Nottinghamshire, was wooing a young lady, but she was resisting his advances. Always knitting, you see. So, he set himself the task of inventing a machine that could do her knitting for her. So then, she'd have no excuses.
And this is what the amorous Reverend came up with.
This is a frame knitting machine. It's producing this, a knitted oblong piece here. Eventually, that can be sewn together to produce hosiery. Much favoured by the ladies and gentlemen. It's a simple principle, same as knitting. You're interlocking loops. These loops are held on these needles. There's a very interesting adaptation to these needles, and that's kind of the secret of the machine, really. They can be closed. So you can add yarn, close it, and pull it through another loop behind, so it hangs. It's a series of hanging loops. You add thread, use the presser bar here to close the loops, and add another set of loops, another row, backwards and forwards like that. Simple principle, ingenious machine. So ingenious, I can't actually do it.
Luckily, Miller here is on hand to show how it's done. He's been doing it for 19 years now, so he's nearly got the hang of it. Whereas a good knitter could knit 100 stitches a minute, a competent frame knitter, that's Miller, not me, could do 600.
And this is what was produced on these machines. Fine hosiery. In fact, it could be very fine indeed. If you knew what you were doing, this is the sort of work that was possible. Complex and beautiful patterns. Just showing off, really. Ironically, the Reverend Lee's machine wasn't used by women. His beloved would never have used it. It took quite a lot of strength to manhandle the frame, so it became man's work. Soon, entrepreneurs started building factories to house the stocking frames. Like this one here in Ruddington in Nottinghamshire. This collection of buildings, the housing, the outhouses, there was even a pigsty, and these frame knitters' workshops with their high, long windows to let in light were all built together in one piece around 1820. There was, no doubt to the Reverend William Lee's delight, a chapel also to keep the workers on the straight and narrow. It's very picturesque. But do not be fooled, because this is most definitely a factory. One of the first factories, and they would set employer against employee. It was a radical change in clothing production, from the home into industrial units, and factory bosses would buy the stocking frames and lease them back to the knitters or pay wages. It was not a smooth transition from home to factory. Knitters were proud of their skills, and formal apprenticeships kept standards high, but the power now lay with the employers, who, desperate to undercut opposition, employed poorly trained workers. The knitters took their employers to court, to little effect. So, under the mythical leadership of one General Ludd, well-organised gangs of knitters smashed the frames of any employers who broke the law. No more chant your rhymes of old Robin Hood, whose feats I no longer admire. I'll sing the achievements of General Ludd, now the hero of Nottinghamshire. It wasn't the last time the rag trade would live in fear of General Ludd, as mechanisation was levered into other areas of clothes and textile manufacture, like here, at Dunkirk Mill in Stroud.
Now everyone could indulge in a bit of stocking now and again. But if anything other than underwear was to become affordable, what was needed was really cheap cloth.
The mill took woolen cloth like this straight from the loom and turned it into something useful, into trousering, coating, cavalry twill, cloth for billiard tables, cloth for uniforms. And this wouldn't have been any good for making clothes because at the first drop of rain it would have shrunk, not very good for the British climate. So it needs to be finished, as it's called. First of all, you need to remove all the gunk out of it, the lanolin, the grease from the loom. You then need to tighten it to get those threads to actually bind together to make as waterproof a surface as you can get. And then when you've done that, you need to smooth the resultant cloth to finish it. For countless generations, this work had been done by hand. But if you had a power source, you could speed it up and make it much more economical. One of the benefits of woolen producing areas is a byproduct of their geography. Sheep do rather well on hills, and hills have lots of running water. This water wheel, at 6 revolutions per minute, generates 74 horsepower. That's a lot of power, and it powered this mill. The traditional method of fulling cloth, to clean it and felt it and shrink it, was to stamp on it in a bucket, walking on it, hence the surname, Walker. The mixture used to clean it was of uric acid, such as could be found in urine, and fuller's earth, such as you'd find in cat litter. For demonstration purposes, I have omitted the cleaning mixture. If you had power, if you had a water wheel, you could use these to full your cloth. Fulling stocks. These are quarter size, but they're still a serious bit of kit. This is a pivot point here. And these hammers here, weighted, are activated by a takeoff from the wheel that lifts this end up and then drops it onto the cloth, which is in a mixture of uric acid and fuller's earth to clean it, to tighten it, and to felt it. After fulling, you're left with lovely clean cloth, but it's rough and uneven. It's been battered, basically. So what you need to do is to smooth it out and to raise the nap, to fluff it up. And you use these. These are teasels. They're a cultivated thistle. They're a bit like Velcro, all got tiny little hooks. And you use them on the cloth, like this, by hand, and that raises it, it fluffs it all up.
But this machine, the gig mill, did away with that job.
So the teasels are still here, but they're now on this circular frame. This is water powered. The whole process has been mechanised. Power from the water wheel comes along the line shaft, down this leather pulley, and then via this rather lovely rack and pinion gear here, I just slide the belt across and insinuate it over the drive wheel. Right. What's happening is the teasels are contra-rotating against the cloth, raising the nap. These rollers pull the cloth over here. Finally, we have this rather lovely eccentric gear. You can just see the arm there that controls this, which just folds it. After it's done its job, the cloth went on to the next stage of the process. The nap's been raised, it now needed to be sheared. Finally finished. Once the most skilled job in the mill. The men who cropped the nap to finish the cloth with their 40-pound shears were the dons of the clothing trade workers. They considered themselves to be very much a cut above all the others. They were cleaner. They wore frilly shirts. They pulled their shirt sleeves up over their elbows and secured them with scarlet cloth, the badge of their office. So when this cropping frame was introduced, it caused havoc. It worked very simply. The cloth was suspended over the frame, and by turning this handle, you revolve this helical blade that evenly cuts the nap of the cloth. Thousands of highly skilled men were thrown out of work and rose up in furious anger under the mythical leadership of General Ludd and smashed the frames.
But in vain. The cropping frames were soon in mills across the country. Now a mill like this was turning out over half a mile of cloth a week.
So we now have a cheap and plentiful supply of cloth, but that's not going to mean cheap clothes, because clothes have to be stitched together, and that is done by tailors, by hand. It takes time and costs a lot of money. Here's the problem. This is a running stitch, a stitch that tailors use. The needle with the thread goes into the piece The needle is then reversed, goes back through, comes out the other side, and the thread is pulled through. Same again, through, thread pulled through, knotted, there we go. To replicate that is really, mechanically, impossible. How would you do it? If you reverse the needle, push it through backwards as it were, into the piece, you now have to take it all the way through before you form a loop. If you have another thread and needle on the back of the piece, that can go through that loop. So, you've hardly used any thread there, pull back, and then that can go through again. Once again, the needle hasn't gone all the way through, you've hardly used any thread, pass that needle again. There you go, that's locked. Hence the name, a lock stitch. And here, on this extraordinary machine, which first came out in 1851, we can see how a continuous lock stitch was mechanised. This is a Singer machine, the Singer number 1, designed by Isaac Merritt Singer. Here's the needle, and the eye is at the point rather than at the other end. Goes up and down, taking the thread into the work, which is going along this table here, pulled along by this little toothed wheel here. Right, so that's the top part of the lock stitch going down. Underneath, you can see here, as I turn the wheel, this mechanism going backwards and forwards. That's providing the bottom part of the lock stitch, the bit that connects with the loop. So you can now sew continuously. Not surprisingly, it revolutionised tailoring.
A sewing machine did away with 10 tailors. It meant factory owners could hire the machines and make savings, hiring cheap operators. After all, those tailors were now desperate for work. Factories with row upon row of machines were set up, creating clothes like these, clothes that were far cheaper than any tailor could dream of producing.
This is a list of sewing machines that Singer manufactured for the clothing trade. Making clothes was being broken down into each of its constituent processes, and there's a machine for every single job. Belt making, Norfolk jackets, collar stitching, zigzag lingerie, rag trade buttonhole, motor coat stitching, sleeve inserting, strapping riding breeches, trouser bottom blind stitch felling, whatever that means. And it wasn't just dressmaking and tailoring that were changing. The sewing machine was going to revolutionise other clothing industries. As Singer said, for every stitching process, no factory complete without them.
Industrialisation of the clothing industry proceeded gradually, starting with the frame knitter for making stockings, but the sewing machine was just the kickstart the industry needed. Once you devised the mechanism for sewing, you could invent machines that could stitch together all kinds of things. It was going to revolutionise industries and change a lot of towns, like this town, Northampton. And what they were good at here was shoes. You can always tell the cut of a chap's jib by his shoe. And I think these are just the very thing. What? And in the early 19th century, shoes of this quality were most definitely made by hand. There was no other way. Highly skilled craftsmen would make shoes on a last, hand stitching pieces of leather and attaching all the various composite pieces using specialist tools like this lasting pincer. The old craftsmen used to have a row of tacks in their teeth so they could just pull them out with the pincers and made sure that they had both hands free. A highly skilled craftsman would be able to make 3 pairs of shoes in a week. But by the 1850s, manufacturers were setting up factories filled with leather stitching machines. A Northampton Boot and Shoemakers Mutual Protection Society was set up to oppose mechanisation, but to no avail. The sewing machines had arrived.
Shoemakers went on strike, but it was a losing battle. By 1864, there were 1,500 closing machines in the town, and that was just the start.
With uppers being stitched mechanically, the race was on to develop equipment to finish what the sewing machines had begun. They've been making shoes here at Crockett & Jones since 1879. The sewing machines aren't quite that old, but this factory is one of the few left that still makes shoes the same way as when the process was first mechanised.
Even pulling the leather over the last was mechanised. In 1883, Jan Ernst Matzeliger, a Dutch Guyanan based in Massachusetts, nice, came up with this, or a machine like this. This is a machine that rejoices in the name of a puller over. Bit of a change from the lasting pincers.
Other machines followed. The Goodyear welting machine, the Blake sewer, the heel compressor, the sole flattener, the finisher, most invented in America. Highly specific machines for the 200-odd highly specific processes required to construct a shoe from scratch, leased out by their makers in return for a royalty for each shoe made. One manufacturer, Gordon Mackay, earned $500,000 a year from his machines, which by 1895 were turning out 120 million pairs of shoes a year in the US alone.
Individual shoemakers closed down their cottage industries and signed up for factory work. How could they compete with this? With fixed hours and wages, it was the end of worker autonomy. The factory age had arrived.
Manufacturers wanting to produce cheap clothes now had a number of tools at their disposal.
Lovely shirt. Very fine.
The frame knitters developed the concept of the workshop or factory.
Very fine stockings. Comfortable and warm.
Cloth makers introduced an external power supply.
The waistcoat. Very fine buttonholes.
And new machines like the sewing machine or buttonhole maker were developed, which could now produce finely tailored waistcoats, jackets and trousers at a fraction of the cost.
Very nice detail. Excellent piece of tailoring.
And shoemakers broke down the assembly of products into stages on a production line.
Excellent boots. Made to last, but supple. Now all I need is a hat.
Now the less well-off didn't have to wear rags, and the middle classes could even start to indulge in fashion. A titfa, a lid, a tile. Weather protection really, but wearing a hat was most definitely a fashion statement. Wasn't it, lads?
But making hats by hand in the early 19th century was a slow and unpleasant business.
You start off with this, rabbit fur. That's what hats are made of. You want to make felt out of this fur. So you don't want any long hairs, you want lots of short hairs that will compact nicely, like the fluff you get in your tumble dryer. And you're using this, it's a bow. You flick it across the surface, you're literally setting the fur flying. Can you see that the lighter and shorter fibres rise to the top? What you do then is you get these lighter hairs, you make them into a triangular shape called a bat, and then you put two bats on top of each other, tease the edges together, and you end up with that, a hood. At the planking kettle, the felt was shrunk. This made the felt stronger and more weatherproof.
They did this by dipping it repeatedly in a readily available chemical solution. Their own urine.
In time, the plankers' hands would become deformed and their skin go really thin. The story goes that one man's hats were stiffer than the others. It was because he had syphilis. The treatment at the time was mercury salts, so that had got into his urine. So it was added to the mixture in the planking kettle. Good for hats, not very good for workers. Mercury poisoning sent them mad. Mad as hatters, in fact. I suppose there's got to be a downside to just fannying around all day with a rolling pin. But madness seems a bit unfair.
But industrialisation turned hat making around. Steam power drove new machinery. The blending box for mixing fur. The conical that replaced the bow. New equipment for each stage of the process.
Another highly specialised machine, replacing a specific part of the process. This former, fur blown in here, mixed with steam from there, forming the body of the hat, felt on the former there, and this would then go to the next stage. And this machine just did one job. It replaced the planking kettle, reducing the body of the hat in size by passing it through 9 sets of rollers, 20 or 30 times.
Which meant no more dipping your hands in mercury-enriched urine.
Mechanisation didn't remove all the unpleasantness, of course. This machine was designed to open out fibres that had been dyed, so they'd been wet, matted together. So they were blown and carded. And then some youth had to go in here, in this chicken shed, and remove all the fibres. Fur, of course, that had been treated with mercury. No thanks. Yeah, like that's going to help.
Making the felt hoods, though, was only half the job.
You turn the felt body into the shape of a hat on one of these, a block. This is one for a policeman's helmet. Evening all. Sorry. If you wanted different sizes, you had to make different size blocks, all by hand. And if you wanted to make a big run of hats, you needed more than one of each, all made by hand, considerably expensive. And that's where this machine comes in. This is a copying machine. There's the handmade block. That wheel takes its outline and translates it onto the wood, cut by the cutters behind. This machine could also increase and decrease in size. So this meant for considerably cheaper blocks, and that meant more and cheaper hats. At its peak, the hatting industry in Stockport employed 8,000 workers in 30 major factories, turning out 5,000 felt hats a week. Mechanisation changed the way in which clothes were made. No longer made only at home or locally by specialist tradespeople, they were now made in factories, mass-produced by companies in cutthroat competition with each other to keep down costs and prices. Economic war has its casualties. Britain no longer has any vast clothing factories, but as consumers, we now expect and get cheap clothing.